few years ago, I worked as a guide and administrator at a historic prison. More precisely, a prison museum in the United States. It was one of the oldest buildings in the city, and it was extremely popular among ghost hunters, so working there always felt a little unsettling. The early years of the prison were quite brutal. Several deaths happened there, including executions carried out under orders from the authorities. Because of that, many ghost stories began to circulate about the place. Even though I personally witnessed a number of strange things during my time working there. The building itself was extremely old. It was a shelter for local wildlife, and it certainly wasn't protected from the wind. Because of that, any supernatural story had to be taken with a fair amount of skepticism. We also had dozens of mannequins placed around the complex. Some stood in the yard, some in the cells, and others in the hallways, recreating traditional prison scenes. It was always funny to hear tourists gasp when they suddenly noticed the first mannequin figure standing in the dim corridor. But there is one incident I still remember very clearly, because the town relied heavily on tourism. The winter months were extremely quiet. Sometimes I could go for hours without seeing another person. One day, I was lucky enough to get a shift where I had to close the museum late at night and open it again early the next morning. Both closing and opening required a flashlight because during that time of year, the darkness outside was almost complete and lighting had never been installed throughout the entire complex. That day, I had only one visitor to fight the boredom. I decided to take one of the spare mannequins from storage. I dressed it in the clothing of one of the early female convicts and placed it in the kitchen of the women's wing. I turned it so its back faced the door, put a bowl in one hand and a whisk for beating eggs in the other. It looked as if the woman was standing there cooking. I made sure everything was secured tightly and locked the kitchen for the night. The next morning, I arrived around 6 o'clock to open the museum. As I walked through the dark corridors of the complex with a flashlight, I suddenly heard a strange sound. The room I was standing in shared a wall with the kitchen, and from the other side came a scraping noise. I stopped and listened. The sound would stop, then start again, sometimes growing louder and accompanied by knocking. To be honest, it made me uneasy. I continued my inspection of the building. The complex was circular, with rooms arranged inside, so I slowly moved along the corridor toward the kitchen. When I reached the door, the sound was very clear. It was irregular, like something was moving and bumping into objects. I decided to look inside first through the small sliding hatch, and that was when I saw it. The mannequin was moving, not just slightly. It was clearly tapping its foot up and down, slowly turning the whisk, raising and lowering its arm. I stood there in the darkness watching. When my eyes adjusted to the dim light, my brain finally started processing what I was seeing, whether it was possession, a poltergeist, or something else. I definitely wasn't going to stay long enough to find out. I slammed the hatch shut and ran back the way I came. I didn't stop until I reached the main office, where I immediately bolted the door and turned on every light I could find. Around 10 in the morning, the first tourist arrived. By that time, I had already convinced myself that what I had seen earlier must have been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I had simply heard the old building settling, and the rest had been my imagination filling in the gaps. But the kitchen was still part of the tour route. So I hung a "back in 5 minutes" sign at the reception desk and quietly made my way back to the kitchen door. I slowly opened the hatch and looked inside. The mannequin stood exactly where I had left it, completely still. I let out a deep sigh of relief and opened the door, and the very second I did, the mannequin started whisking eggs. The arm moved up and down, the whisk spun, and the foot desperately tapped against the floor. In that moment, I felt real terror. This was happening in daylight, right in front of my eyes. I was alone in the prison, with a possessed mannequin, and the next tourist was supposed to walk through this exact room. What the hell was I supposed to do? I remember thinking, it's just plaster and papier-mâché. Just destroy it, smash it quickly and run. I grabbed a meat tenderizer and very cautiously approached the creature. As I moved closer, the mannequin moved faster. When I was within arm's reach, I grabbed its arm, and at that moment there was a horrible, raspy hissing sound. I looked into the bowl. A large king lizard, about 16 inches long, was staring back at me. Its head was tightly stuck between the wires of the whisk, and it was desperately trying to escape. I released the mannequin's arm, and the lizard ran. Trapped in the bowl, it spun around on the bottom, turning the whisk attached to the mannequin's hand. That caused the arm to move up and down, and the entire structure vibrated, making the mannequin's foot knock against the floor. 5 minutes later, I released the poor thing into the yard, still hysterically laughing. By the end of the day, the mannequin was carefully packed up and sent back into storage, just in case. In short, a terrifying mannequin powered by a lizard.